Okay, some things to know about casting. You're going to want a clean surface so you don't mind getting messy. You're also going to want to put on some rubber non-sulfur gloves. And then here we have the actual mold itself. It's a two-part mold. It's held together with rubber bands and some MDF wood. And so the MDF blocks of wood are just to keep an even pressure on the rubber silicone. And so that'll be demonstrated later on. But a two-part mold is exactly what it sounds like. It's two parts of one mold. So I molded one figure, and on each side of the mold is two sides of the figure. One has the front and one has the back. And that's how the mold works. So they go together, and they go together with registration marks. On one side there's bumps, and on the other side there's holes. And so each time you close and open this mold, they will go together perfectly. At the top of the head there's some vents to let out air. And so one of those vents you'll actually use to put a syringe in. I'll show that later. And the other side, there's a vent for the air. So right there you can see an air duct. That's one of them, leading from the tip of a of one of the objects inside the mold all the way out. It's to help the air escape the mold, because when you close this mold, you're liable to trap air. And I'll demonstrate how to get rid of air bubbles later. So as I said, there's a syringe to inject resin, and here's also a brush to brush in resin. And these are all disposable things because this process will be messy. It's going to be a messy process. You're going to want a few things, that being disposable things like paper towels. Keep a ton of those. Here's our resin itself, Easy Cast. It's a cheap resin I got at some hobby store. It comes with a hardener and a resin itself. And so the hardener and the resin go together, right? And so I'm prepping my area, and I've got my measuring disposable cups that are equal and identical, and they're also see-through, which is super important because as we as you'll see, we have the hardener here, and this particular resin is by mass, meaning that the amount of hardener you put in one side of it has to be equal to the amount of resin that you put on the other side. So yeah, and this is super important, to make sure that it's evenly distributed and accurate. So that line should be perfectly matched up with each other, because you'll mix the crap out of them, as you'll see, in this big bowl. And everything here, like I said, is disposable. It's going to get messy, and you're probably not going to get these things back. So use disposable things. Here's a disposable brush. I'm pulling on the hairs of it. Make sure there's no hairs in your cast, because that would be embarrassing. Just kind of tugging at it, getting any loose hairs out. Here's your stir stick. This is what you'll be stirring the resin with. It's flat. So you're going to want something that's flat, that's disposable, that you can use to scrape every surface. And what I'm doing is I'm putting the resin in. It doesn't matter what order you put it in. And I'm scraping the sides of the resin container. Making sure you get every single drop that you put in. Everything you put in to those containers should come out. It's very important that the measurements are correct. This is an epoxy resin. So here I go, putting the hardener in too, scraping every side, every surface. That's why it's so important to have a flat stir. And so as I do that now, I'm actually going to, because the resins are clear and see-through, it'll be hard to show you how to mix it properly. So I'm actually going to dye the resin. It's not necessary. That's just something I chose to do for demonstrative purposes. There I go. And so as you can see, the dye begin to mix. You can see the viscosity of this resin. It's fairly thick, but I do have some working time with it. So as soon as you start mixing, it starts to harden. So you only have about, I don't know how long I have with this. I think it's like an hour or 15 minutes, but I have a lot of time. Some resins you don't have a lot of time. So as I'm doing this, I'm turning the bowl and scrape every single surface. Even scrape the utensil you're using, because there could be some hardener still left in there. You want the hardener and the resin to perfectly marry with one another. So scrape and stir and scrape and stir and get every surface. I begin to now dab the brush, the aforementioned brush, into the mixture very lightly. Because what we're going to do now is we're going to touch every single surface of the inside of the mold, as in the figure itself. So any knuckle, any wrinkle in the clothing, any hair, anywhere there could be detail, there could be a bubble. So we're touching that surface and really making sure every single part is touched. For instance, if there's any area that doesn't have resin on it, it's liable to trap bubbles, like that little hole in the back. That's where the monkey is on Noah's back. That's a big problem area if you don't get some resin down in there. So the brush just ensures that the surface has been touched, so it can accept the resin later that we pump into it via the syringe, because the mold will be closed and there will be no going back, from touching. We can't open the mold and put resin in there, so we have to make sure that we evenly cover it and distribute it, and just go lightly on it. You don't need a lot. Now this is the part where we actually fill our syringe. We get ready to fill our syringe, obviously. Okay, your bubbles are not your friend. You don't want any air. You see a theme happening here. So as you create a pool from the resin, you start to take your time. Really make sure there's no air in your syringe even. So what I'm going to do is a little one of those like doctor things where they tap it to make sure there's no air. You can do that here. Take your time. Make sure everything is seamless, and clean. And like I said, it's going to get messy, so keep those towels around, and you just want to even mass. And you can even take some of the leftover resin and you can dump it in there. They're fairly deep, so it doesn't matter if you get resin in places it shouldn't be, as long as you get those even coverages of the surfaces. And so there I go, putting the resin in the deep, shallow places, the hard to reach places. That could trap air. I'm just pumping it in, even squeezing it as I did. And so get both sides obviously evenly, and again, take your time, because you got one shot and you got all this resin that you're ready to pump into the mold. So make sure you've touched it up perfectly. And watch this. As I close the mold, what I just did, I trapped air inside the mold. So as I hold it together now, you can see the air escaping through the vents at the top. And so I'm just holding it and lightly squeezing it. Lightly squeeze, hold, squeeze, hold, squeeze. You can do this. And as you do this, make sure that you get your MDF and you start to make a sandwich out of it, and make sure no resin escapes the bottom of the mold, the sides. You really want to keep it nice and sealed. And then at this point now, your mold is practically done. However, to ensure that there's no bubbles, what I'm doing is I'm also gathering the remainder of the resin, and I'm filling it up in the syringe. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pump the resin into one of those holes, because there's several holes at the top. Pick a hole, right, and then pump that resin in, and the air should escape through one of the other holes. That's how air will find a way out. I'm cleaning up the mold surface, and what I'm doing now is I'm plugging those holes and I'm turning it upside down. I'm rotating it, making sure all that resin is going all throughout the mold. It's really getting every surface and every area. And as I'm doing this, the resin is curing. It's getting harder and harder, so it doesn't have that viscosity as it did before. This is an extra step. You don't have to do this, but I'm just plugging those holes because I intend to turn this mold upside down. You don't have to do this. You could just leave it right side up and not go through all this, but I'm doing this just because in my experience I've had good results. So now we're just waiting for it to cure, and we'll check back up on it later. Okay, it's the second day. Got my sulfur-free gloves on. Always have gloves when you're handling the figure. And so something about mold making, when you open your mold, never open it up all the way. First, what you want to do is peek inside there at the very top and just peel it open very slowly and just peek and see what do we have in there. What are there any problems? Never pull it out. Never split the entire mold open all the way, because you're going to lose the point of contact all over the mold, and therefore the resin will get over everything when you try to close it back up again. And I should have stopped right there. I go all the way and I open it up all the way. It's been a while. But anyway, I noticed right immediately there's a bubble right in the head that's easily repairable if I had just peeked and closed it, because I could have injected resin right into that top chute again through the syringe. But since I opened it all the way, it's going to cause problems later, as we'll see. So I peel that away, but then I also see the arm is salvageable. It came out actually pretty solid. So as I remove that, it's only the second day, so this resin is still pretty gummy, and therefore you wouldn't want to remove the flashing that you'll see on the sides here. You wouldn't want to remove that the second day, maybe the third day. Give it like another day. But I'm eager. I've got my flat object, like a little razor blade. Don't use the sharp side like I'm doing. That's not smart. But yeah, you just scrape the sides of the cast. You just scrape it, and thankfully I was able to do that. It comes with practice. I mean, it's not like an unsmart thing to do, but definitely it just comes with practice. You don't want to damage your mold or your cast. Okay, so here I go, trying to put the mold back together. So you'll see the problem. There's so much detail on this figure. The reason why you never want to open it up all the way is because you'll never get it closed back the same, exactly the same way, due to the fact that there's a hole on the side of the figure which a plug goes into. And as you open up the mold, that plug comes out of that hole. So as I try to put it back in, it's not like you can put that little plug, right? See that hole right there? As I close it, there's a plug that's supposed to go into that hole. And now it's causing a gap. And I don't notice this at first, but right here you can see the mold is flat on the left side and then it's open on the right side. That's where that plug is now resting on top of the figure instead of inside of it. The plug did not go into that hole. And you'll understand this as you look at the actual mold on your own. So here I go, mixing the resin. My mistake the second time, not only was that, but the dye that I used to dye the resin, because the resin initially is clear, as you can see down there, and that's actually better for casting because it's that clear resin, just the raw resin, sticks to the mold much better. It clings to the surface, but when you add the dye, it actually causes it to be a lot heavier, if that makes sense, like more dense, and so it doesn't actually stick to the surfaces as well. It acts a lot more solid. And that's why the gravity affected the way the actual resin sticks in there. So here I go again. I didn't, and again, this is learning lessons. You figure this out as you go. I found the reason why. I'm like, why is it not? Because I actually attempted to mold this even again after this, after I ruined a good portion of this figure. I attempted it once more again, and even a third time. So it takes time. And I actually ended up stitching together like the top half of this figure with the bottom. I had to Frankenstein it together because certain parts came out good and certain parts didn't. Certain parts were ruined due to mistakes. And so there I go, stippling in the brushing in the resin, and following all the steps as we did before, as I did before. No one was there except me. Yeah, and so there I go, just, wasting a bunch of resin. You'll basically make a ton of mistakes, but, and then I close back up again. That's just gonna pour all over the inside, and we'll see the result, though, of the Frankensteining I was mentioning before. Okay, here's the figure. It's now been a couple of attempts to cast this, and I finally learned that you don't want to use any dye in the resin, which should be not hard. The resin just comes as it is. So use the regular resin. Don't put any dyes in there. Make the mistakes I did. Don't do it. I also spray painted the bottom of the feet. That's just for painting reasons, because later on the whole thing will get a top coat. And so as you can see, the gray areas where the resin is, the gray resin, that's where I stitched together the piece with 2-part epoxy. You shouldn't have to do that though. If you just use the regular any sort of 2-part resin material, you shouldn't have to stitch casts together as I did. But to save time, that's what I did. And so as you can see, the head came out. That's the resin without any dye. So that's the clear resin. And there's the arm, functioning as it is. I'm not going to pop it in. Don't pop the arm in until it gets its coat of flat medium, because that's what's going to help your paint stick to the figure. And then you can assemble it together. So here's the figure. It's been spray painted with a matte medium. It's gray. I just like gray because you can see the details a little bit more clear. And this is what you're going to paint on top of. And so these figures are not obviously like professional grade molds. These are not professional sculpts. It's just something I did as a hobby. And so ultimately, if it were factory paint, I mean, even there you can see a bubble, but paint will fill that in later. So I'm hiding some of those mistakes. But as an amateur, these are just more so for like prototype figures. So you would never really be painting these on your own. The factory would only need just the sculpts. But for demonstrative purposes, I will be painting this figure, of course. Alright, well, here's the final finished figure of Noah. He's been painted with acrylic paint. Pretty basic paint. Like I said, these figures are sort of like working prototypes for a factory that would produce them. But they're just they were just my hobby. So basically, once you've got your acrylic paint on there, you can paint them any color, honestly. Um, Endless possibilities. But on top of that acrylic, just that basic acrylic paint, I put some primer, so some enamel primer, and I did the bottoms, the tops, everything. And even for that process, you're gonna want to make sure that you have a nice dry, clean space. That the even suspending the figure maybe in air with some clay if you can, but just don't touch the figure. You really want to make sure you've got those gloves on because you want everything to stick. You don't want your oils all over the figure. So once it's fully painted and primed with enamel, it's basically done, and you can now pop that arm in there, which shouldn't be a problem. Just make sure it's nice and stiff. You can put it in the fridge or something like the arm, and it'll stiffen up so it can pop into that hole easily. And it'll be fully assembled, fully painted, and it's basically like a model now for you to have. So again, just some final things. So with these figures, like you saw, the process was a lot more tedious for me because it's been a while. But what you're essentially going to want to do is just once you get your resin, read the instructions, see how long it takes to set up, as in harden. How much time do you have to work with it, the pot life of it? Because once you put A and B together, it starts to harden. So you're going to want to read those instructions carefully, and then pretty much just follow those steps. Make sure you get the resin that works well for you. If you like resin that sets up quicker, then get that. But most likely you're going to want resin that sets up a little bit later, as in you have more working time with it, because when you start getting the brush and the syringe involved, time is ticking. So with that, hopefully this has been helpful. My only advice now would just be don't use any dye. Just mix the resin straight up as it is, and mix a lot. Mix a lot more than you think you're going to need, because it's always better to have more than less in this regard. So that being said, hopefully you can get some successful pours out there. It might take multiple tries, so don't become frustrated. This is how one learns what to do, and again, to get rid of those terrible bubbles, because you don't want those. You're going to find all sorts of creative ways to do that, and better ways. So I hope this has helped. This has been a very basic and rudimentary tutorial, but everything else should just come with practice and time. So with that, thank you.